When we talk about the spread of Islam across the world, we often think of regions like the Middle East, North Africa, or Southeast Asia. But one country where the journey of Islam is lesser known, yet deeply fascinating, is Japan. Compared to other parts of the world, the history of Islam in Japan is relatively recent. Japan has never been a majority Muslim country, and even today, Muslims make up only a small fraction of the population. But how did Islam reach this island nation? And what has the journey looked like? To understand that, we have to go way back to the origins of Islam in the 7th century, in the Arabian Peninsula. As Islam spread rapidly through Asia, Europe, and Africa, it didn't make its way to Japan during those early centuries. Japan's geographic isolation and its limited interaction with the outside world meant that Islam had little chance of reaching its shores. Some scholars suggest there might have been indirect contact, perhaps through the Silk Road or via Chinese records. But there's no strong evidence that Islam had any presence in Japan before the modern era. The real story begins in the early 20th century. Around the 1900s, Japanese scholars, military officers, and travelers started engaging with Muslim-majority regions, especially the Ottoman Empire in South Asia. These were Japan's first serious encounters with Islamic civilization. The interest wasn't purely religious. It was political, commercial, and even strategic. Japan was rising as a global power, and the Muslim world was seen as both a partner and a region of geopolitical interest. But what really changed things was the Russian Revolution in 1917. In the aftermath of that revolution, a wave of Muslim Tatars, particularly from Central Asia and Crimea, fled the chaos and persecution and made their way to Japan, often traveling through Manchuria and China. They eventually settled in cities like Kobe, Tokyo, and Yokohama. These Tatars played a foundational role in introducing Islam to Japan in a more formal and community-based way. They built the first mosques, formed local Islamic communities, and began spreading Islamic teachings in a peaceful and organized manner. One of their greatest contributions was the construction of Japan's very first mosque, the Kobe Mosque, in 1935. Built with the support of the Tatar Muslim community, this mosque still stands today as a symbol of Islamic heritage in Japan. Just a few years later, in 1938, the Tokyo Mosque, now known as Tokyo Camii, was built. This mosque was later rebuilt in the year 2000 with assistance from the Turkish government, and today it stands as one of the most beautiful and active Islamic centers in the country. After World War II, Japan went through a period of rapid economic growth and global reintegration. This new openness brought students, workers, and professionals from all over the world, including Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. These new arrivals came for education, business, or labor opportunities, and many chose to stay, laying down roots and helping Islam grow in Japanese society. By the 1980s and 1990s, Muslim communities had become more visible across Japan. This growth wasn't just from foreign workers or students. It also included international marriages and a small but steadily increasing number of Japanese converts to Islam. These converts often discover Islam through academic study, personal reflection, or relationships that lead them to explore the faith more deeply. Today, the Muslim population in Japan is estimated to be between 100,000 and 200,000 people. It's difficult to give an exact number because religion isn't officially recorded in Japan's national census. But what we do know is that the Muslim community is incredibly diverse. It includes people from across the globe: Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Turkey, and of course, native Japanese Muslims. There are now more than 100 mosques and Islamic centers across Japan. These include not just formal mosques, but also small prayer rooms in universities, airports, shopping centers, and workplaces. Halal restaurants and Islamic schools have also begun to pop up in areas with large Muslim populations. What's especially notable is that Islam didn't arrive in Japan through war or colonization. It wasn't imposed or forced. It arrived peacefully, through migration, education, trade, and interfaith contact. And it grew not through mass conversion, but through the quiet, steady efforts of people who built mosques, shared knowledge, and lived their faith with dignity and respect. The Tatar Muslims who fled persecution and found refuge in Japan laid the foundation. And since then, wave after wave of immigrants, students, and converts have built upon that foundation. Today, Japan is home to one of the most peaceful, low-profile Muslim communities in the world. A community that continues to grow, not in numbers alone, but in its contributions to cultural diversity, interfaith understanding, and the rich tapestry of Japanese society. Today, Islam in Japan is still very much a minority faith, but the community is steadily growing. According to recent estimates, there are about 230,000 Muslims living in Japan. That's roughly 0.18% of the total population, a small number in percentage terms, but significant when you consider how recently Islam arrived in the country. The majority of Muslims in Japan are foreign nationals, people who have come from abroad for work, education, or family reasons. But there's also a growing number of native Japanese converts who have embraced Islam for personal, academic, or spiritual reasons. Now, when we talk about the makeup of the Muslim community, one of the important questions is the distribution between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Unfortunately, detailed surveys breaking down those numbers are limited. However, available data and community observations suggest that Sunni Muslims form the majority. This makes sense when you look at where most Muslims in Japan are coming from. Countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, all of which are Sunni majority nations. These individuals bring their religious traditions with them, and over time, those traditions shape the local community. But what about the Shia Muslim population? Well, here things get a bit more complex. Some sources estimate that Shia Muslims make up less than 1% of the Muslim population in Japan. But other reports offer a very different picture, suggesting there could be as many as 150,000 Shia Muslims living in the country. That would actually represent a sizable share of the Muslim community. So why the huge discrepancy? It likely comes down to differences in methodology, how surveys are conducted, how religious identity is categorized, and which communities are being included. Some surveys may count only those who are formally registered with religious organizations, while others may rely on broader estimates that include undocumented or unaffiliated individuals. Regardless of denomination, Japan's Muslim population is served by a growing network of religious infrastructure. There are now more than 110 mosques and Islamic centers scattered across the country. These aren't just places for prayer. They're vibrant community hubs where people come together for religious festivals, educational programs, charity work, and cultural exchange. Two of the most prominent examples are the Tokyo Camii and the Kobe Mosque, both of which serve as important landmarks for Muslims in Japan. What's notable is that these institutions are often open and welcoming to both Sunni and Shia Muslims, providing shared spaces that encourage unity and mutual respect. So even though Japan's Muslim population is still small compared to other nations, it's diverse, dynamic, and growing. From Tokyo to Osaka, from foreign students to local converts, the story of Islam in Japan is one of resilience, community, and peaceful coexistence. And as the country becomes more globally connected, these communities continue to contribute not only to religious life, but to the broader social and cultural landscape of modern Japan. Although Muslims make up a small minority in Japan, their lives are anything but invisible. Across the country, Muslims are quietly and meaningfully weaving their faith into the fabric of everyday Japanese life. And despite the challenges of being a minority, they've established vibrant, supportive communities that blend religious observance with the rhythm of Japanese society. Daily life for Muslims in Japan revolves first and foremost around their religious practices. Performing the 5 daily prayers is central, and for many, this requires a bit of creativity. In major cities like Tokyo, where the Tokyo Camii Mosque provides dedicated prayer space, things are relatively easy. But in other areas, Muslims often make do with quiet corners in universities, designated rooms in workplaces, or simply transform a small space in their homes. It's about adaptation, holding fast to tradition while adjusting to a different environment. Friday prayers, or Jumu'ah, hold special importance. Every week, mosques and Islamic centers open their doors to the community, facilitating congregational prayer and spiritual connection. These gatherings are often, followed by social interaction, shared meals, or community announcements, fostering a real sense of belonging. During the holy month of Ramadan, the communal spirit deepens. Muslims across Japan break their fast together at iftars hosted by mosques or organized in university dorms and homes. The Tokyo Camii, Kobe Mosque, and other Islamic centers often serve hundreds of meals each evening. When Eid arrives, it's a joyful occasion, complete with special prayers, festive meals, and cultural celebrations that bring together people from all walks of life. Of course, living in Japan means navigating practical issues, like food. Access to halal food has come a long way. In cities like Tokyo and Osaka, halal-certified restaurants and grocery stores have become increasingly available. International supermarkets stock imported halal meat, and many convenience stores now label vegetarian-friendly or alcohol-free products. But outside the urban centers, the options thin out. In rural areas, some Muslims choose vegetarian or pescatarian diets, simply because halal meat isn't accessible. It's yet another example of the quiet compromises Muslims in Japan make to maintain their faith. Mosques are more than just places of prayer. They're community hubs. They host religious classes, cultural activities, language lessons, and interfaith dialogues. For example, it's not uncommon to find a Japanese language Quran class on one floor, while downstairs a group is discussing Islamic ethics over tea. These spaces become safe havens, not just for worship, but for connection, learning, and support. Online spaces also play an important role. Platforms like the Asagohan Club offer a digital lifeline, especially for Muslims living in more remote parts of Japan. Through these online communities, Muslims can gather daily for study, share reflections, and stay connected to a broader spiritual network, even if they don't live near a mosque. In terms of education and work, Muslims are contributing into Japan in real, meaningful ways. Many come to Japan as students, enrolling in universities that increasingly accommodate their needs, offering halal meals in cafeterias, prayer rooms, and support services. Others work as professionals in fields like tech, academia, healthcare, and engineering. They are part of Japan's diverse workforce, bridging cultures and bringing unique perspectives to their professions. Now, where are these communities most concentrated? The answer lies in Japan's urban and metropolitan centers, where infrastructure and support systems are stronger. Tokyo is home to the largest Muslim population, over 30,000 people. It has everything from mosques and prayer rooms to halal restaurants and cultural centers. Osaka and Kyoto are also home to well-established Muslim communities with long-standing mosques and halal-certified businesses. In Nagoya, the Muslim population continues to grow, and local institutions are responding by creating spaces and services to accommodate them. Yokohama and Saitama, both near Tokyo, are popular among Muslim families because of their proximity to the capital and access to Islamic schools and mosques. Shizuoka, while smaller in population, has a very active and engaged Muslim community, about 700 people strong. And in Gunma Prefecture, there's a particularly close-knit group of Rohingya Muslims who have built a life together, supporting each other while preserving their heritage and beliefs. What's truly remarkable is how these communities have maintained their faith and traditions while also integrating into the wider Japanese culture. They contribute not only through their professions and families, but through cultural enrichment, education, and dialogue. Muslims in Japan are living proof that religious identity and national belonging can coexist, respectfully, peacefully, and meaningfully. So while their numbers may be small, their presence is deeply felt. They are teachers and students, engineers and chefs, parents and neighbors. And they are helping shape a Japan that is just a little more diverse, a little more connected, and a lot more understanding. While the Muslim population in Japan is gradually growing and becoming more visible, living as a Muslim in a predominantly non-Muslim society presents a number of unique challenges. These challenges aren't always obvious from the outside, but they shape daily life in very real ways. From cultural misunderstandings to infrastructure gaps, Muslims in Japan often find themselves balancing their faith with the demands of a society that's still learning how to accommodate religious diversity. One of the most persistent challenges is social integration and prejudice. Japan is known for its hospitality and politeness, but that doesn't mean everyone fully understands Islam or Muslims. In fact, many Japanese people have limited exposure to Muslims, and unfortunately, global events and media portrayals have sometimes shaped negative stereotypes. These misconceptions don't usually translate into open hostility, but they can lead to subtle forms of exclusion or awkwardness, whether it's in the workplace, in schools, or just during casual conversations. There's also a general lack of awareness about Islamic customs. For example, things like prayer times, fasting during Ramadan, or avoiding pork and alcohol can seem foreign to many Japanese people. Without understanding, even well-meaning individuals might unintentionally say or do things that make Muslims feel out of place. It's not always malicious. It's often just a gap in knowledge, but that gap can create invisible barriers in social and professional life. Then there's the issue of food, which is central to both daily living and religious practice. In big cities like Tokyo and Osaka, halal options are becoming more common. You'll find halal restaurants, grocery stores, and even some university cafeterias that cater to Muslim students. But step outside those urban areas and things get much more difficult. Finding halal-certified food can be a challenge. Some Muslims end up traveling long distances, ordering imported goods, or adjusting their diets by choosing vegetarian or pescatarian options. Not out of preference, but out of necessity. Dining out, something many people take for granted, becomes a source of stress. Language barriers can make it hard to ask about ingredients, and many restaurants simply don't offer halal meals. Access to religious facilities is another concern. While the number of mosques in Japan has grown, especially in major cities, they're still relatively few in number. In smaller towns and rural regions, Muslims often don't have a nearby mosque or even a dedicated prayer space. This makes it hard to attend Friday prayers or participate in religious events. Even finding a quiet spot to pray during the workday can be a struggle. Many employers don't provide prayer rooms, not out of ill will, but simply because they're unfamiliar with the need, and requesting accommodations can be uncomfortable, especially in a culture that emphasizes conformity and not standing out. Another deeply sensitive issue is burial practices. Japan has a long-standing cultural norm of cremation, but in Islam, burial in the ground is a religious obligation. This difference creates major complications for Muslim families. Finding appropriate burial plots can be extremely difficult, and even when efforts are made to establish Muslim cemeteries, they sometimes face pushback from local communities. People express concerns over land use or environmental impact, which adds another layer of resistance. For Muslims living long-term in Japan, this isn't just a practical issue, it's an emotional and spiritual one. On a broader level, Muslims in Japan also face legal and institutional challenges. There have been cases where Muslims were placed under surveillance by authorities, which raised concerns about religious freedom and privacy. In a country with few Muslims, such actions can feel isolating and even threatening. On top of that, Japan currently lacks comprehensive anti-discrimination laws. That means if someone experiences religious or racial discrimination, there may be little legal recourse. It can be frustrating and even disheartening for those trying to build their lives in Japan. But in the face of all these challenges, the Muslim community continues to push forward. They're not just quietly enduring, they're actively working to build understanding and bridge cultural gaps. Community leaders and organizations have launched educational outreach efforts, hosting interfaith dialogues, school visits, and public events to explain Islamic beliefs and practices. These conversations help break down stereotypes and create spaces for mutual respect. At the same time, there are real strides being made in infrastructure. Halal certification programs are expanding, making it easier for restaurants and businesses to cater to Muslim needs. Prayer spaces are starting to appear in airports, shopping malls, and even tourist destinations. Bit by bit, the landscape is changing. Despite the obstacles, Muslims in Japan continue to contribute in meaningful ways to the economy, to cultural diversity, and to community life. Their presence enriches the nation's social fabric and reminds us that true inclusivity requires more than tolerance. It requires understanding, empathy, and shared effort. If you found this journey through the history, daily life, and challenges of Muslims in Japan informative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth stories like this one. Share this video with friends who might be curious about Islam around the world, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts or experiences. Your engagement helps us bring more stories that matter to light. So hit that like button and stay connected for the next episode.